Alright guys, Bill, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, for the 5th anniversary of the sequel to one of my all-time favorite graphic adventure games, here I'll be doing a video talking about my thoughts on Life is Strange 2. The last Life is Strange game I haven't done an individual retrospective on, which ended up being a game that, coming into it the first time, I was pretty apprehensive on how I would feel about this game. I mean, it was a game that was changing characters and settings from the OG game. I was worried it would lack the charm of the OG game, and sadly, I feel like a lot of that ended up being warranted. Like Before the Storm, I feel like it takes away much of what I loved from the original game, where that obviously ended up being this focused, smaller scaled story based on the themes of nostalgia with a nice splash of sci-fi to boot, while this game ends up being on a much grander scale, one that feels like it's meandering and bloated at points, still having these coming of age aspects to the story, but more so focused on pretty different themes within that, more so focusing on the brotherhood between Sean and Daniel, which wasn't nearly as interesting to me as the development of Max Caulfield. Now, the game does technically have better dialogue and facial animations than the OG game, while also having it that your choices end up mattering a bit more to the actual outcome of the story, instead of it just entirely being this binary choice. But I still don't particularly like Life is Strange 2, especially in comparison to the likes of the OG game and True Colors, with my opinion of it really even going down even further on my replay here. But to talk about all my thoughts on the game, I will be running through it from beginning to end. With that, let's start off with Episode 1, Roads, which always gets criticized as a slow start to the season, but I've actually never personally minded it that much. I think this is one of the better episodes of the season, being a solid intro to the Sean and Daniel dynamic, along with the on-the-run nature of this game's story, though obviously introduces the game's themes in a really over-the-top way that does lead to some humor at just how over-the-top it is. But anyway, the game starts with you being asked which ending from Life is Strange 1 you got, which kind of gives you this impression that the endings of the original game is going to play a major factor into the story here, though it really ends up playing as minimal of a factor as it could have. Anyway, the opening scene here ends up showing us dash cam footage of an upcoming incident with an officer, them getting blown away as the footage gets overtaken by static, really foreshadowing the inciting incident for the story. But after that, we then transition to a shot of a school bus driving through the suburbs of Seattle, as we see the main character of the story in Sean getting off alongside his best friend and Lila, which they end up having some friendly banter. Though we also get talk here about him wanting to hook up with Jen Murphy at the upcoming Halloween party, a character that never ends up appearing. But instantly, Sean does come off as pretty relatable here, fitting in line with the type of characters you would expect from any coming of age story, while also the scene ends up being utilized to really showing you what Sean ends up missing out on, showing these aspects of a more peaceful life that Sean could have had everything not crumbled around him. But anyway, they discuss preparing for the party, to where they end up creating a list of items for Sean to gather, which ends up being our objective in the following scene. Those also here where we do see them encounter Brett Foster, Sean's neighbor, who instantly comes off as a massive dick, which I wonder if that'll be relevant moving forward. But anyway, we arrive at the DS household, where we end up meeting Sean's family here, his father Esteban and his little brother Daniel, who are arguing over who gets the last candy bar in the house, which Sean can decide on who gets it, which doesn't matter. Though after this, we get our first explorable area in the game here, where again, we are looking around the house here for those party supplies. We're in the kitchen, we have a choice between which foods we end up bringing, including a choice between beer or soda. We end up having to find a blanket in the storage room, though going to the garage has us being able to talk to Esteban, seeing him fixing up a car for Sean's graduation, obviously showing him as a loving father here, though that's matched with some tedious gameplay of us having to find him a wrench. But this ends up leading to a pretty strong conversation here, the only conversation we have Esteban on his own, with Esteban essentially setting up the story here by telling Sean about how Daniel looks up to him, essentially foreshadowing the role that we're going to play on Daniel's character moving forward, also talking about how dangerous the country is right now, which is, again, a bit of a heavy-handed line there, though one that does also foreshadow the troubles that Sean and Daniel are going to have moving forward. But here we do also end up asking Esteban for some money, to which you can tell him the truth of what you're using it for, and if you do so, he gives you an extra $20, which is kind of an introduction to the currency system where you will eventually be able to use this money later in the story, though really none of this actually matters that much. Or even though there are things you can buy at points moving forward, none of it actually ends up having a major impact on the story. But anyway, here you can also have your first conversation with Daniel by going to his room, which ends up being a pretty typical relationship between an older and younger brother, with him kind of teasing Daniel about his crush on Lila. Anyway, the section ends by returning to Sean's room, where there we can make our first drawing, which is a thing that happens pretty commonly in this game. You can find this area that has you drawing the things around you, and it's just kind of a boring mechanic, one that doesn't really add much in my mind outside of obviously just continuing this notion that Sean wanted to be an artist. Though the actual mechanics around this system always felt super finicky to me, to where it just makes you move the analog sticks in any random direction to draw, which just felt weird. But either way, during the call of Lila, we do have Sean kicking Daniel out of the room, to which we eventually see Daniel go outside, to which Sean ends up seeing Brett grabbing Daniel's arm, leading to us going outside to defuse the situation, where it turns out that Daniel has spilled fake blood on Brett, leading to again the inciting incident for the entire story, where Sean ends up intervening, trying to keep the peace until he snaps when Brett mentions their mom leaving them, which feels very tropey, but this has Sean knocking him onto a rock, to which he hits his spine, leading to the officers arriving somehow. Don't know who called the police, and this leads to a pretty dumb misunderstanding here that does feel extremely contrived, which has always been kind of an issue of me with this game's story, is how obviously this is supposed to be this commentary on police brutality and gun violence, though it just comes off as so on the nose and just feels like a situation that was so avoidable, though I guess that's like kind of the point, though it still comes off as pretty dumb to me when I'm seeing these things happen, of Esteban arriving on the scene to try to reason with the cop, only for him to pull the trigger and killing Esteban, obviously killing Sean and Daniel's only parental figure here, obviously being this misunderstanding of thinking that Brett was more hurt than what he really was because of the fake blood, and obviously seeing a cop unnecessarily kill an innocent man, one that is obviously a POC, and again, it is all these things that were these big talking points, especially at the time this game came out, though I feel like the overall writing to lead to this incident just makes it come off as pretty over the top to me, though it is obviously the death of Esteban here, and ends up leading to Daniel unleashing his powers for the first time, him screaming and unleashing the shockwave, sending the officer flying, and knocking Sean out. Now, I will say Daniel's powers here are never explained, which I don't feel like they necessarily need to be, as really the superpowers that do appear across the series have never truly been explained across any of the games. But I think something that bothers me about Daniel's powers in this game in particular are the fact that they are just so generic. Towards his power just feels like one that you would give to just any random superhero, very different from these more unique powers that Max has of being able to reverse and manipulate time, which does play into the nostalgic themes of that game's story, or in True Colors where you have Alex Chen having the power to feel people's emotions, obviously playing into her character. I feel like Daniel's powers here of just being able to create shockwaves and lift things is just a very generic trope here that doesn't really play into his character in any significant way. Either way, we have Sean awakening afterwards to see the neighborhood being wrecked by the shockwave and the cop now dead, to which Sean picks Daniel up and flees as more cops arrive, which is also another plot point here that does come off as kind of contrived. Now, I get that the game explains it as, oh, he's worried that if the police catch him, that he's going to be separated from Daniel, so they go on the run for the rest of the game, where him going on the run here just feels like it makes the situation entirely worse. Now, at the end of the day, again, he is still pretty young, and obviously there's a lot going on here to where it makes sense that someone would think illogically in this situation, and again, it does play off the themes of not fully trusting the police to do what is right, though I do feel like as a whole, this is a situation that could have been mended pretty easily had they just stayed, as you would assume that they would have been figured out that Sean and Daniel did nothing wrong. But again, we needed a story, so obviously they're on the run the rest of the game because that's kind of what it has to be. Though obviously it gives this game this massive road trip vibe. Obviously playing off of the tropes of these road trip coming of age movies that for sure was a major inspiration in this game, though I do think it is an inspiration that does feel misguided to me. It feels like a type of story that is much more beneficial for the film medium than it is for a video game. It ends up making this story one that struggles with maintaining focus, as it largely comes off as episodic, having characters and plot threads come in and out of the story, so much to the point where it feels like the core plot really doesn't progress much throughout most of the game. Where I feel like you can literally skip over literal episodes of this game and not really miss that much of what's actually going on in the story. Now you might question, isn't this the exact same thing that The Last of Us does? Obviously my favorite game of all time, and what is in my mind the best written game of all time. And you would be right on paper. I mean, The Last of Us does have a very similar formula, obviously focusing on this relationship of Joel and Ellie as they travel across the country. However, I think a major difference is how the stops along the way are utilized to progress their relationship, where every single stop for Joel and Ellie is utilized in a way that steadily progresses their relationship to the point where they are this full-fledged father-daughter duo. However, Life is Strange 2 is handled in a way that, while you can tell that their relationship grows across this game, it isn't as incremental, it isn't as purposeful as The Last of Us is, with also many of the stops along the way not seeming to really progress their relationship that much, and through that makes a lot of this game comes off as largely underdeveloped. Though I will say at the same time, I do respect the fact that they did take this radical departure from Life is Strange 1. So I do respect them trying something new and not just copying the exact same formula, but I feel like they changed it so much to the point where it does make you question, why is this even Life is Strange? Why not just make it part of a new series? Kind of what they did with something like Tell Me Why, which has this Life is Strange feeling to it, but obviously isn't the actual Life is Strange game. It very much feels like Life is Strange 2 should fit into that mold. But either way, the story does progress as we cut 2 days later, as Sean and Daniel are now on foot, heading towards a national park, which entire sequence ends up establishing the brotherly bond between the two, showing Daniel having to embrace his protector role, which instantly gets tested through Daniel seeing a chocolate bar and an abandoned car, and we get the choice here of agreeing to take it or not, which introduces us to the morality system of the game, which ends up being one of the more fascinating aspects of this game in my eyes, where Sean's decision-making in this game, essentially our decision-making, ends up having a major influence on Daniel's character, to which it can affect things that Daniel does across the story, but also more importantly affect the endings of the game. Though at the same time, strangely has very little influence on what is happening short-term in the story, though again adds this theme of brotherhood in this game that I do think is pretty interesting. It shows how the choices you make end up affecting those around you, how it develops this character in Daniel, which is essentially the secondary character that ends up being influenced by decisions that you make. Again, showing how one's role as an older brother can affect the development of their younger brother. And again, I feel like that is a very interesting dynamic to add to this game, kind of being this indirect ramification for the choices you make. But anyway, as we follow the path here, it becomes pretty clear that Sean has not told Daniel about what has happened, making him believe that they're on a camping trip instead of obviously being on the run and that their father has died. Though along the way, we do get some downtime with them being able to play hide and seek or eat some berries, to which we can see some of the new mechanics being added in here, like having conversations mid-gameplay, and being able to choose certain dialogue options. You also have a mechanic to call Daniel, which sadly they took away the memeability of it by not allowing you to continuously repeat the call in the way that it's done in Heavy Rain. But either way, eventually they do reach the river, where they end up taking base under a rock formation, to which we have a tedious section of us having to set up camp. Though settling around the campfire has us eating the food that we picked out earlier, again a very minor ramification of the choices we previously made. Though overnight we do end up seeing another test of Sean's protector role here, and him having to console Daniel from having a nightmare. So it obviously ends up playing out differently based on how we previously handled him, though there's also an aspect of if you had eaten the berries earlier, Daniel ended up being sick from them, which ends up feeling like another failure being added to Sean's belt there. But either way, we continue on the following day, where we do end up coming across a gas station, where we get talk about stocking up on supplies that don't end up mattering. Though here, there are a few activities that you can do before entering the store. You can freshen up in the bathroom, you can fill your water bottles, you can dig through the trash for food, and also just beg for food from a nearby family. Though again, the main event is actually entering the store, where you can choose to purchase or steal many items within it. Being able to use Daniel as a distraction fraction if you were to steal, though really a lot of this section doesn't really matter, as, and yeah, you can buy things, though these items don't really end up affecting how the story plays out here, though either way, to progress the story, you do need to get a map that's inside the store, along with some sort of food to progress. Though also while here, you can talk to the storekeeper and Doris, along with you meeting Brody, who becomes the first of our ally characters we meet along the way. It was also while here that you could see a puppy that Daniel wants to adopt, one that Doris will refuse to allow you to take, as only adults can take care of puppies, though is obviously one that we end up seeing later on in the story. How the section does end by sitting at the table outside where they will eat, only to then be stopped by Doris's husband Frank, who accuses them of stealing, whether or not they do, which obviously has some pretty major racial undertones to it, but is here that you can choose to discuss with him, attack him, or flee, but no matter what, Hank ends up knocking you out. And this game does this quite a bit in giving you these wide range of options to do things, only for them to all lead to the exact same result, which is obviously a common criticism of graphic adventure games like this, though I do feel like Life is Strange 1 kind of handled it pretty well, where typically it would be two largely different outcomes within that individual scene, and while the ramifications moving forward were probably not as large as what you would think they would be, at least it made you feel like they were major ramifications, while here it just simply doesn't, as it's really exactly the same no matter what you pick here. But either way, we end up awakening at night, where Sean has been tied to a pipe in the back office of the gas station, with Hank telling Sean that he knows that they're involved with the Seattle incident and plans on turning them in, to which if you piss Hank off here, he will then kick you in the face, which is a really OTT portrayal of Hank here, as obviously this massive racist here, but either way, ends up leading to a puzzle section that leads up to the escape, which eventually has us getting help from Daniel, who's right outside, who's able to get him free. But either way, you end up getting caught by Hank on your way out, to which Daniel will use his powers to knock Hank out, to which we'll end up having the option of kicking Hank in this situation, and end up stealing the camping gear nearby, which is a choice that again doesn't really matter outside of just a changing of assets later on in episode 2, but either way you end up escaping, with the brothers ending up coming across Brody, who agrees to help them out, drives them away, to which Brody ends up coming off as a largely likable character here, though one that does feel a bit underdeveloped, largely because that is just an issue with this game. The fact that this game, again, because of the road trip nature of it, it does have this revolving door of characters, these characters that you meet to help out Sean and Daniel for a short instance, only for them to be written out of the story immediately afterwards, which ends up leading to a lot of these characters just not really getting the time to breathe, not getting time for you to fully get to know them and really do that much in the story outside of just end up being this minor assistance. But it's also here where we get the reveal that Daniel had taken the stray dog that we had seen earlier, to which we end up adopting him and naming him Mushroom, which is a nice moment. But it's also here where we get the first reference to the events of Life is Strange 1, where Brody will end up parking the car at Otter Point, which overlooks Arcadia Bay, which will either be there or be completely destroyed based on the previous ending that was chosen. A really pointless scene here, one that is largely here for fan service, one that really doesn't mean anything to the characters themselves, doesn't really mean anything just in general. It's simply just here because they were like, hey, we can make a reference to Life is Strange 1, though again doesn't really add anything to the story here. But it's also while here that we do get the first mention of Sean's plan about escaping to his father's hometown of Puerto Lobos, which ends up being the end goal of the game, one that ends up taking the entire game for them to reach, which is again kind of another minor issue with this game. The fact that again this goal of Puerto Lobos is set up all the way from the beginning here, however it feels like we're making such minimal progress in reaching that location throughout most of the game. And again, while you can tell when paying attention to the story that you are slowly getting closer and closer to the Mexican border, it very much feels like it's happening by happenstance more so than the characters actually achieving in their goal of getting closer to Puerto Lobos, which kind of makes the overall goal of getting there feel like kind of an afterthought for most of the story. But anyway, Brody ends up stopping at a motel where he orders rooms for the brothers as we await on the beach, where we can play fetch with Mushroom, though afterwards Brody ends up bidding farewell because that's most of this game for you, of him just being written out here for seemingly no reason. But Brody has a nice exit from the story here, giving them supplies and advice on his way out, particularly the advice of getting rid of Sean's phone to avoid being tracked, which makes you question, how did he not think of this earlier? But either way, we get to the motel room where as Sean ends up preparing a bath for Daniel, we can see the first ramification of our previous choices, where had we shown Daniel that it's okay to steal, we'll notice the fact that he stole a toy from Brody's car, which is a nice little detail there, though we also have Sean then planning on getting rid of his phone, to which we have the choice of making a final call to Lila or not, which in doing so, they'll both have this pretty sad farewell to each other, both being on the verge of tears, and talking about the status of their friendship. With Lila, again, being a really likable character here, the one that ends up, again, not playing that major a factor for most of the story. But going back inside, Sean finally decides to tell Daniel about Esteban's death, but before he's able to do so, Daniel wants a drink, which feels like a massive plot convenience, really just being here just so that Daniel can be shocked by the reveal of Esteban's death, as we do get this short sequence of us having to go to get a drink from the vending machine, only for us to then hear Daniel's yell, and us returning to find Daniel having seen the news and learning about his dad's death that way, which makes him lose all control of his powers. Again, just feeling very tropey here. Either way, next morning we see Sean and Daniel boarding a bus, with Sean telling Daniel a bedtime story that ends up mirroring their story, but being told under the perspective of them being two wolf brothers, which ends up being essentially the basis of the previous on segments moving forward, where every previously on is essentially through the context of Sean telling that story in that frame way. But anyway, with that, we're moving on to episode 2, Rules, a solid continuation off the first episode that really expands upon the relationship between Sean and Daniel and provides them with a decent amount of downtime while also providing some further background into their characters, though at the same time, some of the episode does feel pretty monotonous, to where while again there are some interesting characters added along the way, the overall narrative progression here is relatively slow. But either way, the episode does start off 2 months later with Mushroom running around the snow as we see Sean and Daniel having taken refuge in an abandoned cabin in the middle of a forest, where we do have Sean and Daniel doing training sessions to harness Daniel's power, but it's here where we also see Daniel beginning to cough, with him having a fever, making it clear that he is sick, obviously something that's later used to move the plot forward. Returning to the cabin gives us a pretty tedious section here of having to make dinner, which has us having to find items around the cabin, and us having to light up a stove with their father's lighter, and finding a pot in the bathroom, and pouring a can of ravioli, and again, it's just kind of a monotonous section, though afterwards Sean ends up having to find a map of Oregon in Daniel's hideout, which again can be the tent that you stole in episode 1. So to do so, you have to get Mushroom to move, which has you having to get Daniel to help you in that. So again, all this is pretty dumb, but eventually we do see Sean revealing to Daniel his plan to go to Beaver Creek in order to find their grandparents in order to get help for Daniel's sickness, to which Daniel ends up agreeing, but wants to play one last dice game before leaving for some reason, during which Daniel will end up cheating using his powers, and again, you can call him out for it. But next day, we have the brothers leaving the cabin, to which they'll notice that Mushroom hasn't returned, to which we end up sadly having to follow a trail of blood, which ends up leading to us finding Daniel in front of Mushroom's corpse, having been killed by a cougar, and Daniel ends up using his powers on the cougar, only for Sean to end up having the choice once again here of stopping Daniel or to not intervene. While obviously not intervening here has Daniel snapping the cougar's neck, though otherwise the cougar will end up taking Mushroom's body, with all this obviously just being a very sad sequence of events here, where obviously it does make sense that Mushroom is killed here, as it doesn't really make sense for them to be continuously on the run with a puppy by their side, but it's still sad that this ends up being the way that they write him out here. But with that, we then cut to their arrival at their grandparents' house, them being Claire and Stephen Reynolds, and us being allowed to stay as long as Daniel's recovering from his fever, with the overall portrayal of Claire and Stephen here coming off a bit strange to me. I mean, Stephen for the most part comes off as largely likable, though Claire always came off as a bit apprehensive to the brothers here, and obviously a bit secretive, to where I never found her to be the most likable figure in the world. But either way, while here, there really isn't that much narrative progression, outside of obviously just introducing these new group of characters in this setting that ends up not really affecting the narrative too much on a grander scale, though this ends up being the first time that we see the connections to the Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, the free tie-in game that was released before Life is Strange 2, that Claire in particular shows up in. Obviously the setting was Beaver Creek, so you can obviously tell the connections to that game are starting to become more prominent. Before going to sleep here, we do see Sean and Daniel talking about their mother, to which Daniel, wanting to learn more about her, ends up playing a major factor into later events into this episode. But either way, we then cut a week later, where Daniel's sickness is really never mentioned again, where he ends up kind of being healed by this point, and it's just never even mentioned. But anyway, we get this pretty lengthy section of just kind of nothing, of us finding Daniel and Steven playing with his model trains. We get called down for breakfast, to where we do have a conversation with Claire about their mother, though again she ends up being extremely secretive there, which makes you think there's this like big mystery going on here, though it really ends up being nothing. But either way, eventually we get talk about going to the backyard shed, to which when doing so we see Claire deciding to go for a walk, aka this is obviously when the events of Captain Spirit end up occurring, with Claire leaving the house on her own and Daniel and Sean going to the backyard, where we see them at the end of Captain Spirit. Though before we get to that, we're tasked with doing some chores, which is boring. But again, we end up finally going outside to where we get the events of the ending of Captain Spirit, where we see Daniel saving Chris from falling, causing him to believe that he has superpowers, obviously explaining that revelation at the end of Captain Spirit. Though it's in this instance that we see Charles ending up rushing outside to apologize to Chris, obviously tying into the confrontation we see at the end of that game. Though I do find it strange how the rest of Captain Spirit doesn't really seem to matter to Life is Strange 2 here, where again, that game obviously ends up being a nice introduction to Chris's background, though none of that is really factored into this game, feeling kind of like this just added content that doesn't really matter, to where while Charles's negative side is definitely implied moving forward, it never ends up actually affecting the overall story here, and really just the characters of Chris and Charles only end up appearing in this episode, which makes it feel even more pointless. But anyway, next morning, Sean ends up finding out that Daniel's already at the Ericksons, while Claire and Steven are at church, which ends up giving us some time alone in the house, where here we have the opportunity to call Lila once again, which can have an effect on the ending of the game. Though this phone call can be very different based on if you called her the first time or not, where if you did, she'll pick up the phone and they'll still talk about the stress that she has been under due to the brother's disappearance, while otherwise, her mom will pick up the phone, revealing that she's in a clinic due to her deteriorating mental state, which ends up being a more somber way for Lila's character essentially written out of the story here. But either way, we eventually go to the Ericksons, where we find Daniel using his powers to allow Chris to think that he has powers, which ends up playing into a later decision that we have here of us essentially telling Daniel whether or not to reveal to Chris that he does have powers or not, which ends up affecting Chris's outcome in this episode. But following this, we get a weird game of us having to guess which of Chris's toys are heroes or villains, a game that really just doesn't matter and feels like a waste of time. Though it is during this that we can ask Chris about Charles, to which we start to learn about his alcoholism and abuse, though again, that doesn't matter that much. But it's also here where Charles ends up asking them to come with them to the Christmas market for some reason, to where while doing so, we can buy a present for Daniel, or also just steal a toy from the donation box, which is pretty messed up. But this ends up being a more important sequence, largely because of the introduction of another character, one that surprisingly appears in more than one episode. It's mind-blowing. That character ends up being a homeless musician here named Cassidy, with her revealing that she is from a group of freight hoppers heading towards California, which might actually matter, surprisingly. Though it's also here where we get introduced to our friend in Finn, who is just kind of there for now, though they end up being kicked out of the market by the end of this scene, to which I'm sure we'll never see them again. But during the drive home, we do have the opportunity for Sean to talk to Charles about his alcoholism, to which we can convince him to get help, but really again, none of this really matters as we don't really see the ramifications of this. So while this minor payoff to Captain Spirit, it's done so in a way that again doesn't really affect the story of Life is Strange 2 itself. But returning to the Reynolds house, Daniel ends up really wanting to visit their mother, Karen's room, to which we end up helping him out and getting into the room to where we can find the key inside Claire's cardigan, or just let Daniel break the door open with his powers. Either way, we end up exploring the bedroom to find recent letters from her that tell Claire and Steven to help Sean and Daniel, with Daniel now wanting to find her. But it's in this moment where Claire ends up bursting into the room and confronting them about breaking her rules. Which obviously, I guess I understand her being upset at them breaking her rules when they're staying in her house, but at the same time, it is kind of dumb that she just doesn't want them to know about their mom. But as they argue, we end up hearing Steven yelling downstairs, to which he just somehow got pinned under his cupboard somehow. But it is here where we get the choice here of pulling him out together or using Daniel's powers to save him, which in doing so, it'll cause Steven to not be harmed, while otherwise his legs will be permanently injured, which is just kind of depressing. Really just kind of being this like weird segment here of like what was the point of Steven's injury, I guess, outside of just testing Daniel's morals once again. But though it's also in this moment where the police end up ringing the doorbell, leading to Sean and Daniel having to escape now. Sequence ends up playing out differently based on whether or not you tell Chris the truth or not. Or if you told him the truth, Chris will end up helping them escape, showing them a shortcut to avoid the police, while otherwise the brothers are spotted by the police, with Chris jumping in front of a car, thinking that he can use his powers to stop it, only for him to obviously get run over instead, which is just kind of depressing. Though again, is essentially the final scene that Chris is actually in the story, outside of minor allusions to what he could be doing down the road. But again, just kind of a weird payoff to the Captain Spirit story, where it could literally just end with him being hit by a car because he thinks he has superpowers. But anyway, the episode does end with Sean finally giving Daniel his Christmas present before they jump onto a freight train, which we do get a post-credit scene of us hearing Cassidy's voice, which I love how like this is supposed to be this like big moment of like, oh my god, Cassidy, she's back for episode 3, when it's like, who cares? But anyway, we get to episode 3, that being Wastelands, an episode that I used to look at as my favorite in the season, as it felt like the most focused episode of the bunch, entirely comprising of Sean and Daniel's adventures on the pot farm, and really leaning into the coming-of-age story for Sean, though in retrospect, it really just ends up epitomizing my issues with the entire season, introducing a wide batch of characters here that all disappear by the end of the episode, with very little narrative progression in terms of the core plot, and even then not really focusing on the relationship between Sean and Daniel that much, outside of Daniel's jealousy and Sean spending more time with other characters than him. By the way, the episode does start with a flashback set before the events of episode 1, with Sean chasing Daniel after he steals something from his room, leading to a pretty pointless conversation with Esteban and a reconciliation with Daniel, with the reveal that Daniel had taken Sean's watch as payback for him spending more time with his friends than with him, which again just kind of plays into the themes of the episode. Though here Sean can let him keep the watch, which doesn't play a factor in the story moving forward, which makes you question, why was this even a plot thread? And really, this entire flashback sequence does feel a bit arbitrary to me, where again, obviously it does introduce that initial theme, though again feels like something that isn't really necessary to the story here. Anyway, we end up returning to the present, where 2 months after the events of the previous episode, we see Sean and Daniel now living in a camp filled with hippies, introducing a new bevy of characters that all don't end up mattering that much. But here we have them working on a legal marijuana farm in order to earn enough money to reach Puerto Lobos, because I guess that's a thing they need to do, is work on a pot farm for months in order to get money. But we do get a pretty jarring opening scene here of Sean awakening and us getting introduced to a new character named Hannah, as she's topless as she heads towards the shower, which is just kind of bizarre for a Life is Strange game. But anyway, the story progresses through heading to the lake, where we find Daniel doing some target practice with Finn, with the two clearly having bonded here, with Daniel clearly looking up to Finn in the way that he wants to end up looking up at Sean, with Sean also feeling some jealousy due to their relationship as well. But after a mini game of us doing some target practice ourselves, we end up hearing Big Joe arrive, one of the workers on the pot farm, who's there to pick up the group and take them to the farm, to which we then get to introduce to the relationship between Sean and Cassidy, which ends up clearly being a flirty one there, one that Daniel is clearly jealous of. Kind of showing this further divide between the two brothers here, with Sean attaching himself to Cassidy and Daniel attaching himself to Finn. Anyway, they arrive at the farm, where we see Big Joe be a dick and slap Cassidy in the back for no real reason, to where you can intervene or not, which doesn't play a major impact either way. Here we end up meeting Meryl, the owner of the farm, obviously the antagonistic figure for the episode, who kind of comes off in a Gus Fring sort of way that I feel like that was probably intentional. But anyway, he ends up splitting the group up between those outside and those that would trim weed buds, with Meryl being upset at Daniel for asking if he can switch groups, and this leading to Sean being warned that if Daniel continues to act this way, he'll face consequences, which is kind of stupid, as all Daniel did is ask if he could switch groups. But either way, this leads to a pretty tedious mini game of doing these QTEs, of trimming the weed buds, though it does allow for some downtime between these characters, which is at least nice to see in that light. But anyway, after a shift, we end up returning to the camp, where here we have a nice conversation with Finn, learning about his background. And following this, we can do some optional objectives like peeling potatoes with Hannah or washing dishes with Daniel. Though either way, you're forced to do a pretty tedious task of moving 2 water tanks to the kitchen and showers, though you have the option of asking Daniel for help while doing these. Though following this, we end up having Sean take Daniel out to the lake for training. All of this training that doesn't end up amounting to much, which I will say this game does have a lot of sequences of you trying to train Daniel, which obviously plays into this brotherly nature for Sean and him trying to teach Daniel, though I don't feel like it actually ends up amounting to that much in the story, where again it has this thematic representation in the story, but in terms of how it actually ends up affecting the plot, it simply doesn't. Like, Daniel's controlling of his powers doesn't really lead to anything of significant value in the story moving forward. It feels like it's simply there for its thematic message, which I think is kind of underwhelming that they weren't able to fully piece that together into actually doing something in the story. But again, here we do see the rift between Sean and Daniel, with Daniel clearly coming off as intimidating here, being able to lift a massive stump out of the water and seemingly doing so just to taunt Sean here. But following this, we do have a campfire sequence that ends up being this pretty lengthy bonding session between all these new characters, which is pretty nice to see. So again, even though they become irrelevant moving forward, I do feel like it's at least nice to have all these different stories being told. But here we do also get the choice of being able to get a haircut or just going straight to bed with Daniel, to which if you do get a haircut, Finn will end up giving you a mohawk and you end up having a discussion over Sean's sexuality, feeling like set up to the potential Finn romance, implying Sean's bisexuality, which considering every character in the Life is Strange series up to this point has been bisexual, I guess outside of Chris from Captain Spirit. It's nice that obviously follows that trend here, but anyway, next morning, we have Sean awakening late and almost missing the truck to the pot farm, though ends up making it anyway, leading to a weird montage of their shift where this weird pop music plays that really feels anti-Life is Strange, which is predominantly focused around this like alternative folk music. But here it feels like this music that you more so see in this like GTA game than anything. But either way, while everyone is collecting their payments, we see Daniel once again being mistreated, being told to stay outside due to only adults being able to get their payment, during which Big Joe will catch Daniel trying to sneak inside, which just leads to Meryl firing Sean and Daniel and refusing to pay anyone, which is just kind of a massive dick move. And again, just feels like this massive contrivance of him being so upset at Daniel for like these very minor things. But it is also here where Big Joe will then proceed to attempt to beat up Daniel, which is weird that they're planning on beating up a little kid. But Daniel obviously uses his powers that hit Big Joe with an ashtray, to which at this point, Sean will get the choice of taking the blame for it or not, which if you don't, then Finn will get the blame for it. But either way, someone will get punched by Big Joe. So again, none of it really matters. So following this, we do have Sean and Daniel spending their last night in the woods, where Daniel reveals his powers to the others in the group, with Finn now coming out with a plan of using his powers in order to rob Meryl and end up escaping, a plan that Cassidy is openly against, obviously setting up these two different sides of which one you're going to eventually side with, where agreeing to this plan will start the Finn romance branch, with Finn kissing Sean in that situation. Though also here you can end up talking to Cassidy, where you can decide to join her in skinny dipping, which can potentially start their romance, though that romance is dependent on what you chose with Finn, where if you decide to side with him earlier, she'll be upset at you for wanting to join the heist, and this will lead to Sean leaving with Daniel and Finn, while otherwise this can lead to Sean and Cassidy sleeping together, being this clear coming of age moment for Sean, feeling like a typical scene that you would see in any coming of age movie. By the way, this still leads to you finding out that Finn and Daniel went through the plan anyway, meaning no matter what, you have to leave anyway, heading to the parking lot where you have to attempt to steal a vehicle. Obviously, who you're there with varies on the path you took, where if you join the heist, you're there with Finn and Daniel and have to help them in breaking a lock and destroying the security cameras, while otherwise coming with Cassidy, you'll have those things already done. Instead, you'll just be focused on starting up a car, though you can also sabotage the other cars while here, though again, it barely plays a factor. And just determining on whether or not Big Joe shows up in the final scene here. Anyway, this section is just kind of lengthy and kind of boring as well, but anyway, after starting a truck, you can drive to Meryl's place, where if with Cassidy, you'll end up finding Daniel and Finn when you arrive, leading to a big argument between the group. Though weirdly, you are given a final choice here, finally deciding to agree with the heist, where in doing so, Cassidy will leave you if you do. But if you don't join the heist, then Daniel will end up attacking Cassidy, being upset at Sean for spending too much time with her, which is kind of ridiculous, but plays into the themes of the episode. But either way, Meryl will end up being alerted either way and end up catching them. But again, you have a number of ways to interact with Meryl here, none of them being particularly effective because that's this game for you. Though if you use a nearby shotgun in this situation, that can lead to Finn being killed here, which again doesn't play major ramifications down the road, but it's still shocking that he can actually die in this situation. But no matter what you end up choosing here, Daniel's powers get out of control and him unleashing a shockwave similar to how it was in episode 1, culminating this episode in Meryl's house being destroyed, with Daniel being gone by the time we awaken, along with Meryl's money from the safe, with a piece of glass having impaled Sean's left eye, obviously being this massive low point in the story here of Sean seemingly having lost everything, and it leading to us having to spend the rest of the next episode trying to track Daniel down, leading us to episode 4, Faith, where the entire season goes off the rails in my opinion, where again, we spend the entire episode separated from Daniel. And while the concept of trying to get back with him and showing how far Sean will go to do so can be an interesting thematic storyline here, it ends up mostly just being kind of a boring episode with also some really ridiculous moments. And also just the bizarre, religious cult storyline that just largely feels like a pointless deviation. But either way, the episode does start with a dream sequence of Daniel urging Sean to find him, only for Sean to wake up in the hospital 2 months after the previous episode, with his hair conveniently shaved to kind of nullify the haircut choice in the previous episode, also having his eye covered in a bandage due to him having lost his left eye due to the glass. While here we can find letters from the likes of Cassidy or the Reynolds or Chris that give us updates on them. Nothing of any true significance, though eventually we end up meeting Daniel's nurse, Joey, another likable character that just disappears after his scene. After some exams involving his eyesight, we end up meeting FBI agent Flores, who really just gives us a whole bunch of exposition about what happened in the time in between, and also revealing that Sean will be moved to another location tomorrow, adding this urgency on us having to escape by then. Though it is also here where Sean ends up finding his notebook, leading to the reveal that Daniel has escaped with Jacob, which makes you question, who is Jacob? Again, literally a character that I just did not find relevant enough to even mention up to this point, where he's literally just a side character that showed up during episode 3 on the pot farm. He was there, but just really bizarre that he becomes like a major character for this episode. Anyway, he's taking him to his hometown in Haven Point, Nevada, with us now having to escape and end up going there. To which the escape plan starts at nighttime, where there are numerous ways for you to escape, though each of these ways end up involving you having to break off a bar from the bathroom, though here you can escape through involving Joey, where you can call him up and convince him to help you, to which he will allow Sean to knock him out with the bar, or you can just knock him out even if he doesn't agree to help you. There's also another option of you creating a fake body and closing the curtains that can lure a guard in, or you can knock him out with the bar, allowing you to escape, or you can literally just use the bar to pry open the window, which is just the easier route here. By the way, during the escape here, if Finn is still alive, you'll see him in another room and have the opportunity to say goodbye to him. Otherwise, Meryl will be in the room instead, and you don't get the opportunity to talk to him, which I don't get why they decided on Meryl being the other character here instead of one that you actually have more of a connection to, but whatever, I guess. But anyway, we end up stealing a car through hotwiring it, leading to Sean driving in the middle of the desert until the car conveniently ends up being low on gas, and stops in the middle of nowhere, leading to a dream sequence of him on a road trip with Esteban, which feels kind of random and very much feels in line with the dream sequences we saw in Before the Storm, which I don't know what this series' obsession is with these dream sequences of you in a car of your father, but anyway, you get awoken by two men that are unhappy at Sean trespassing on their land, with them very clearly coming off as having these racial biases that ends up, again, just being over the top during this moment. But the men end up raiding his supplies and can break Daniel's toy for some reason. So here we have them demanding that Sean says some self-deprecating things in Spanish and end up singing a song for them. All this obviously being extremely humiliating. And again, really playing into the racial themes of this game, with him being beat up if he doesn't comply here. But again, just feeling like a scene that's just kind of unnecessary. Again, just kind of reinstating these themes that kind of just come off as really over the top, even back in episode 1 with Frank. And considering these events here, and again, them being brought up once again in the final episode, I just feel like this scene was entirely unnecessary. But either way, the next morning, we have Sean walking alone on the path to Haven Point, to which we can rest under a billboard until a truck stopper ends up stopping to pick him up, to which we can accept or decline his help. Declining while Sean continuing on his own on foot, while accepting will have you getting the opportunity to meet the trucker here, which again feels like another kind of generic trope here of the trucker being this nice, kind-hearted guy that ends up giving him a sandwich. But either way, you eventually arrive at Haven Point and reach a nearby church, where we end up seeing a girl and her father being outside, the girl clearly being sick, and talk about there being a miracle at this church, which I wonder what that will be. But going inside has us meeting Lisbeth Fisher, the pastor of the church, and we see her introducing the angel Daniel, who demos his powers, obviously showing the church having taken Daniel in, with him kind of being the basis around this like religious cult here, which is just a kind of weird plot thread here, a weird direction for the story to go here, especially considering it, again, doesn't really matter to the overall plot. But we do get a short reunion between Sean and Daniel here, only for Sean to realize that Lisbeth is using Daniel here to bring more followers to her group. And when Sean wants to take Daniel, Daniel reveals that he wants to stay at the church for some reason, not really explained. And through this, Sean is kicked out of the building at gunpoint, which is just so over the top, especially this coming from a church. But while Sean is protesting here, we do end up seeing his mother Karen show up, I guess, picking him up and telling him to stop, which I largely am conflicted on Karen's role in the story here. With Karen obviously being a character that I expected to see at some point in this game, there had obviously been a lot of setup to her eventually showing up. But I do feel like her overall characterization is weird, as the game clearly wants you to look at her as a sympathetic figure, and one that is like genuinely helping Sean and Daniel and being this parental figure for them at this point, which is weird considering the fact that she literally ran out on them and didn't talk to them for years. But either way, we get a sequence at the motel where, as Sean is awaiting Karen's return, he ends up setting up a meeting with Jacob, which ends up being the following scene, though it's also while here that we can talk to Karen, where she reveals why she left and that she wasn't meant to be a wife or a mother, which obviously justifies her walking out on them. But I do also find it funny that it gets revealed that she doesn't even find Sean and Daniel on her own here. She had to be prompted by Jacob asking her for help somehow, which again just makes Karen come off even less likable here. The fact that she just kind of stumbles her way back into their lives. But anyway, you have the opportunity of being nice to her, telling her off, but either way you end up agreeing to work with her for Daniel's sake, to where after meeting up with Jacob, we end up working alongside him as well. Though it is also funny that you can also scold him for bringing Daniel to Lisbeth to begin with. But either way, we end up agreeing to work together, as Jacob also wants to save his sister, the girl that was at the front of the church earlier. So it just all starts with us having to sneak into Lisbeth's house, which on the way there, you can be caught by cultists, but either way, you'll be allowed to get to the house, to where there we get to explore it. But through this, we get the reveal that Lisbeth has actively been stopping Sarah Lee from getting treatment due to her seemingly actually believing in what she preaches, which kind of shows you her own delusion. Though either way, a cult member ends up arriving at the house, and if we were caught earlier, then they will end up finding us here. something that ends up not mattering anyways. Either way, we're taken to the church where we end up confronting Daniel and Lisbeth, with Karen conveniently showing up in this instance as well to try to convince Daniel away from Lisbeth. Where again, it's funny considering like Daniel barely even knows Karen in this situation. But here we have Sean getting beat up by the cultists and is prepared to be shot, only for Daniel to obviously end up saving him. Again, a really over the top moment. But somehow it gets even more over the top where the building ends up catching on fire, leading to an attempt to escape, only for that to be stopped by Lisbeth, who locks the doors, again making her come off as this maniacally evil villain here. And depending on your previous choices, Daniel can strangle her, though this ends up being an instance that does show us the ramifications of our previous choices, where again this does show us Daniel's morality at this point in the story, where based on our previous choices, if Daniel's morality is low, he'll end up strangling her, to which Sean can convince him to stop or just let him snap her neck. Otherwise, Sean can just get Daniel to move her out of the way. Either way, we end up escaping, as obviously. But again, still a really ridiculous sequence there and a really over-the-top storyline. And one that just, again, comes off as almost entirely pointless, as it really doesn't progress the story really at all outside of the introduction of Karen. And we do end the episode here, thus saying farewell to Jacob and Sarah Lee, because they're characters that definitely mattered. Well, that takes us to the end of the game, episode 5, Wolves. A strange conclusion to the season, with most of it still being focused on a new set of characters that they add to this episode for some reason. Well, again, the back half of the episode continues with its really heavy-handed messaging that comes off as ridiculous once again. So while it is a relatively short episode, it is one that still feels like it has a bevy of issues with it and does largely come off as anticlimactic. By the way, the episode does open with Sean and Daniel sleeping near a canyon cliff, with it being revealed that they are staying at a hermit town nearby named Way, which they've been staying at for a couple months now. But this ends up being a bit of downtime for the characters, obviously feeling like this calm before the storm. By the way, they eventually return to Way, where there they'll see that Karen has gone into town to get some supplies. So while here we get to know this new group of characters that we don't really get much time to actually care about. The likes of Arthur and Stanley and Joan, all of which that don't matter. However, in Karen's trailer here, you can find letters from Jacob and Sarah Lee, from Finn and Cassidy. You can also check on Lila's social media on the computer. Also, here you can find Daniel with Joan, where you can help him make a sculpture for her out of the nearby metal objects. You can also play a treasure hunting game with Daniel, as you finding treasure based on hints that he gives you, though it's really an objective that you could just straight up decline, and either way it's just pretty boring. But eventually Karen ends up returning with groceries alongside David Manson, aka fan service. That doesn't really add that much. Obviously, being a character from season 1, one that is just such a random appearance here, as it really just comes out of left field. And again, while it is cool to see more connective tissue between the games, it's also something that again doesn't really benefit the story that much. Anyway, right away, he ends up making a reference to either being divorced from Joyce or Joyce just outright being dead, depending on which Life is Strange 1 ending you got. And really just the overall concept of David surviving is a bit strange, to where obviously the outcome where you sacrifice Chloe and David having just left town after his divorce, that kind of makes a bit more sense. But the other outcome is David just somehow surviving the storm and essentially being the only survivor that was inside Arcadia Bay, which just kind of dumb. But either way, we do get this weird deviation of Karen taking the brothers back to the canyon cliff where they hold this like lantern ceremony, and that's just kind of boring. Though it is during this where we get the reveal that the authorities are tracking them, and Sean and Daniel need to leave the following day if they plan on reaching Porto Lobos, which finally becomes the main objective once again. In the morning, we end up saying goodbye to these new characters. Again, pretty pointless that they were introduced to begin with, though here we get to explore David's trailer, which ends up containing a lot of references to the OG game, most notably a modern photo of Max and Chloe if you had the Sacrifice Arcadia Bay ending, and also you have this conversation with David where he'll mention his past, which is obviously different based on which ending you picked, and we'll end up either getting a phone call from Joyce or Chloe based on which one is alive, which again, the fact that he's getting this random phone call from his ex-wife is kind of weird in the Joyce situation. And very much so, it does feel like the Sacrifice Arcadia Bay ending is kind of glorified in this sequence, where I still stand by that. I do think the Sacrifice Arcadia Bay ending is just kind of stupid, as it kind of nullifies the entire themes of the original game, and Max essentially learning nothing through the course of the original game, and her literally allowing an entire town to be destroyed for the sake of one person. But it does feel like that's the ending that leads to the most interesting content for Life is Strange 2, and considering there was also a comic written based off of that ending, it does feel weird to me that seems to be the ending that Don't Nod puts more credence into. Anyway, Sean and Daniel end up leaving to where we have this farewell of Karen to where we can choose to hug her or not, which again, doesn't matter. Then once arriving at the border, Daniel will tear a hole in the wall, which in doing so, he gets worn out, which kind of nullifies the entire point of all the training we've been doing, which is also just extremely convenient, as before crossing the border, we have the two getting ambushed by some vigilantes, I guess, that are just patrolling the border for illegal immigrants for some reason. Obviously, the implication being that they're racists that just get joy out of this, I guess. But here we see them shooting Daniel for some reason and pinning Sean to the ground. Again, all this just being really over the top once again. But either way, the police end up arriving and arresting all four of them, either Sean awakening in a cell alongside a Mexican couple who had crossed the border, with the vigilantes being in the next cell. And here Sean can talk to the couple in Spanish, to where, when doing so, the vigilantes will be upset at them not speaking English, which again is just so on the nose here. By the way, eventually Sean is taken to the interrogation room, where the cop essentially ends up asking Sean about his previous encounters, which can be looked at as the game confronting you for the actions you made across the game, though again not being done in nearly as satisfying of a way as it's done in Telltale's The Walking Dead. But the lights eventually end up flickering, obviously having Daniel breaking the door open and knocking the cop out, which the brutality that Daniel ends up using through this scene ends up being based around Daniel's morality, though here you can also choose to free those in the cages if Daniel's morality is high, while also having the opportunity to take revenge on the vigilantes if his morality is low. And again, on the way out, you also have the choice of attacking or distracting some cops, to which again, if Daniel's morality is low, end up killing them. Again, all this feeling like this payoff to the morality system across the game, to where again, while it is very minor changes here, all these changes that don't end up affecting the core plot, it is nice to see your choices have some impact on some of the smaller details here, though either way, we end up escaping and driving towards the border once again, only for us to then find a police barricade with Agent Flores attempting to convince the brothers to surrender, giving us the final choice of the game, a choice of either surrendering or crossing the border, which in a way is still a binary choice to end the game, which is obviously a major criticism I have of Life is Strange 1. However, there is an added element to all this in the fact that Daniel's morality ends up changing which branch of the two choices you end up getting, where essentially there are four main branches of endings that you get here, with even some variance within those as well, which again kind of makes it feel like your choices matter a bit more. Now, I will say, after doing a more in-depth look at all these endings, it's still not good enough in my mind. It's certainly not to the level degree of something like Detroit Become Human or Heavy Rain, which I think handles its endings in a lot more impressive of a way, while here it's essentially just a slightly better version than the binary choice that was there in the original game. But anyway, I'll still talk about the main branches here. The first one ends up being Redemption, which is the ending that you get if Sean surrenders and Daniel's morality is high, essentially being the quote-unquote good ending, where this will have Daniel accepting Sean's decision to surrender, having Sean being taken away by the police, giving us a montage of photos showing what happens over the course of the next 15 years, a motif used in each of these endings. But here we end up seeing Daniel living a normal life, to where by the time of 2033, Sean is released from prison, where he ends up reuniting with Karen, Daniel, and if you had called Lila in both opportunities beforehand, she will be there, because I guess that's what makes the difference and all that. To which I will say, there is talk about how this game has 7 possible endings, though again, literally Lila appearing or not is considered 2 of those endings, which is kind of dumb. But either way, this ending ends with this nice final scene of the brothers returning to the national park they spent time in episode 1, one before parting ways. This nice full circle ending, and them doing essentially what is looked at as morally right, and Daniel being able to live out his life in peace, and the brothers getting this nice nostalgic trip at the end. Again, all a nice enough ending that kind of wraps things up pretty well. The second branch we're going to talk about is the lone wolf ending, which happens if Sean surrenders, but Daniel's morality is low, which will essentially have Daniel not agreeing with Sean's decision and deciding to force the car through the barrier, which in doing so will lead to Sean getting shot, which I don't get why this is only the case in the situation where Daniel forces the car through and not in these other situations where they actively go through. But either way, this will end up leading to Sean being killed in the process, but Daniel still ends up making his way to Porto Lobos, though he ends up living on his own, turning to a life of crime and gang fights, pickpocketing and robbing banks, to where 6 years later we'll have Daniel visiting Sean's grave, only to be attacked by a gang that he's able to easily fight off using his powers before walking off into the distance, with this probably being the worst possible ending here. Obviously Sean dying and Daniel living a life of crime, really an ending that doesn't come off as too satisfying here. The next branch ends up being parting ways, which is a situation if Sean decides to cross the border, though Daniel's morality is high, where in this situation Daniel will help Sean through the border, though will end up jumping out to let himself get captured so that Sean can escape, essentially him disagreeing with Sean's decision to cross the border but still supporting him in that instance, which in this outcome Daniel will end up living out a similar life to how he did in the redemption ending, where 6 years later we'll see Daniel living with the Reynolds and talking to Karen on the phone while still receiving photos from Sean, who ends up making it to Porto Lobos, though has 3 separate branches where he can be alone or he can be with either Finn or Cassidy if he had romanced them, and again Finn isn't dead or he didn't ruin his relations with them by the end, which again is considered 3 separate branches here, which is just kind of dumb considering it's a very minor change to these endings. But again, a fine ending. I would probably rank this 3rd of the 4 branches. Again, it's at least better than the lone wolf ending in my mind, but one that just feels kind of weird, as if you do have Daniel's morality as high, it just feels like a weird decision for you to also choose to cross the border in this situation, which makes this ending feel kind of conflicted with itself. But either way, with that we get to the final ending, which is essentially supposed to kind of be the bad ending, where this is the ending where Sean chooses to cross the border and also Daniel's morality is low. However, I actually feel like this ends up being one of the more satisfying outcomes here, where in this situation Daniel will step out of the car and end up attacking the police on his own and presumably killing them, allowing the brothers to reach Porto Lobos unfettered, obviously being this sour outcome in that light, and the fact that Daniel literally just killed a whole bunch of cops. But it does lead to us cutting 6 years later, where we see them running a car repair shop similar to their dad, though I will say it's not really set up in any way beforehand that Sean and Daniel would be interested in doing something like this. By the way, we end up seeing Sean being held up at gunpoint, only for Daniel to end up saving him, kind of reinforcing this brotherly bond between the two that, again, I kind of like this ending. Like, even though this is supposed to be the quote-unquote bad ending in the sense that it's one where you continue to go on the run and Daniel's morality is low, I actually feel like this is a somewhat satisfying ending. I think it's on par with the redemption ending. Obviously 2 radically different endings, but I think both satisfying in their own ways, with this at least feeling like one that does end up having us reach the end goal of Porto Lobos and still fit within the themes of brotherhood that ends up being a major one across this game, though I will say I probably do slightly prefer the redemption ending, as again that's just the type of ending that I personally prefer, but this is still not entirely bad ending in its own right. But there we go, and that is the entirety of Life is Strange 2, a game that, despite me talking this long about it, it's a game that I simply just never really connected that much with, especially not as much as the original game, and straight up, I don't even really like this game that much. Again, it just feels like it's void of a lot of things I loved from the original game. While it does have interesting ideas, like the focus on the sibling relationship and the effect that an older sibling has on a younger one, and a story largely mirroring that of a coming-of-age road trip movie, I do feel like in execution, it comes off largely disjointed, having a revolving door of characters that make it really tough to truly care about anyone outside of Sean and Daniel, which I guess is kind of the point, but it just feels weird that you're introducing all these characters that simply just don't matter. It obviously has a muddied plot that has a bevy of filler in it, and also some really over-the-top thematic messaging that really makes some of the game's more dramatic moments kind of come off as laughable instead. Now, despite those issues, I don't hate this game. Again, it isn't Before the Storm, which I think is an embarrassment of a prequel and a game that I do actively loathe, but the main word I largely think with this game is simply just apathy. Again, it's not good, but it's not so bad that I outright hate it either. I simply just don't care that much about it, which is, again, ironic considering how long I talk about the game here. But again, it is largely a game that the only connection I have to it is that it's part of a series that I have a grander connection to. And with that, I mean, those are my thoughts on Life is Strange 2, the last Life is Strange game I needed to do a retrospective on. Now, that said, I do still actually plan on doing another Life is Strange video down the road, that being an episode ranking for the entire series, which should be fun to put together. And also, at some point, probably for the 10th anniversary of Life is Strange, which is a little bit over a year from now, I actually would like to redo my original Life is Strange retrospective, going way more in depth into that game, as I feel like there was so much untapped potential in my original video. So maybe stay tuned for that at some point down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.